Dear friends, dear readers, dear YouTube followers, welcome in Arouca Press YouTube channel. As you know, my name is Gaetano Masciullo. I'm a historian and philosopher, freelance journalist, and I am guiding you through the rich offerings of Arouca Press, exploring works by great authors in its catalog. Let's embark on this journey together. Arouca Press is a Catholic publisher committing the publishing both new and out-of-print gems to aid in reinvigorating the intellectual and devotional life of Catholics in every state of life. And today we have the honor of speaking with Professor Brian Welter. Thank you to be here.
Thank you. I'm not exactly a professor. I teach English, but I don't have a position as professor.
So I am Italian, and we are used to call all teachers professors.
That's nice. Thank you.
Okay. And today I'd like to speak with you about this book, Christian Paideia. This is the first volume of a series. I think, if I have well understood, this series is made up by 2 volumes, right?
That's the initial plan. And yes, the second one is under editing now, so it'll come out soon. I'm working on a third one. I don't know if it's considered volume 3, but the original intention was 2 volumes, yes.
Okay, so of course you can find the first volume of this series on www.aroucapress.com, as you may read here. Before to begin, I'd like to ask, can you briefly present yourself?
Okay, well, I'm originally from Canada, from Saskatoon, and I studied history. And I study mostly medieval and early modern history. And then I went to Montreal for 4 years to study French. And I was interested in theology. So I studied theology at McGill, not necessarily to become a priest or a pastor, although I thought about church service. And after that, I did a master's in theology and eventually went to South Korea and taught English. And since 2001, I've mostly been an English teacher in Asia, briefly in Vancouver, but either in South Korea or Taiwan. And now I'm in Toulouse, teaching English and pursuing a doctorate in second language acquisition.
I see. Why did you write this series of books about Christian Paideia?
Well, it came out of my teaching in Taiwan, where I found that students had a hard time with logic, with setting up an argumentative essay in English. And also they didn't understand connotation and author's tone, which sounds like rhetoric to me. I was helping them with the SAT preparation and AP English, AP literature. And I found that a lot of these problems, they were not because the students were Taiwanese and were struggling with the English, because their English was fluent and they were going to American schools in Taiwan. It was because I think it's just a cultural shift that the education system is not challenging students enough. For example, teachers will say that they are teaching their students critical thinking, but I didn't see evidence of my students understanding critical thinking. And I don't even think people know what that means. Everybody might think of critical thinking in a different way. They each have their own definitions of it. So I wanted to be clear. And because of my background in theology, I thought the church was also perhaps in need of this. When you look at education in the church, it seems to be pretty weak.
Yeah. What's the structure of the series and the first book in particular?
Well, I think in the preface, I mentioned that I was inspired by a book by Edgar de Bruyne, who was a Belgian who wrote in French. And he wrote Studies of Medieval Aesthetics or something like that. It was in French. And when he wrote it, almost 100 years ago, he left a lot of the medieval writers in Latin untranslated. And the other thing that he did, as I mentioned in the preface, is that he didn't give background to Aristotle, Plato, Seneca, Cicero. So there were a lot of gaps in that book. But if you think back to those decades, people were probably well educated in Latin and in the classics. So I thought I wanted to do the same thing for Paideia, that specifically for the Middle Ages, that he did for aesthetics. But I thought that I had to give more support to people who might not be familiar with Aristotle, Plato, Seneca, Cicero. So I tried to include a lot of the original Greek and Roman writers at any time in the book, particularly at the beginning. But anytime there's a new concept, then I will try to remind the reader of where that begins, because a lot of Christian Paideia is, of course, based on the Greeks and the Romans, but they Christianized it and then it became something else. Or you could say that they brought it to fruition.
Yes, of course. I think there is a strong influence by great teachers, medieval teachers like Aquinas and this tradition.
Well, I don't talk about Aquinas so much in these books. I would, it's certainly I spend a lot of time with Augustine, discussing Augustine. He was probably the biggest, most important voice. But I was very intrigued by Origen and his own teacher, Clement of Alexandria.
Yeah.
And that's a very big topic. And if you can read French, you might be familiar with a French philosopher, Pierre Hadot, Hadot. And he married a German woman, Ilse Traut Hadot. And they wrote about how philosophy was, for the Greeks, almost like what you would call schools of psychoanalysis today with Freud and Jung and so on.
Of course.
So they were interested in the development of the soul or psychological development, and they each had their own approaches, just like Jung and Freud and Adler had their own approaches. So this is what philosophy was. And so one of the key terms to this book is what is wisdom? What did they mean, Seneca or and then the Christians like Augustine, what do they mean by wisdom? Why is that important? And it's a very deep topics. And with Origen, he thought that Christianity was the fifth school and the final school and the true school of philosophy. And I thought that's very, very intriguing. And that was my favorite part of the book, was the whole Clement and Origen part of the book, because this is where Christianity and philosophy were not so different back then. They fit together in a way.
Yeah.
So, like I say, we can use the word fulfillment, that the church fulfilled what the Greeks were teaching while it remained true to the Hebrew roots.
That's really interesting. You mentioned Pierre Hadot. He wrote a book titled, at least in the Italian translation, I read the Italian translation, Esercizi spirituali nell'antica Grecia, spiritual exercises in the ancient Greece, literally. I don't know if the French title and the English title of the English translations sound the same, but
it does sound the same in French.
yeah,
Yes,
it's really interesting, right? Because the idea of spiritual exercise recalls Saint Ignatius of Loyola. So this is
well, it also if you read Gregory of Nyssa and the Cappadocians, and then they pick up on this and they expand on what Origen said. And so there's a book that was became popular in the 18th century, the Philokalia, Love of the Beautiful, which has been recently fully translated into English in 5 volumes. And it's mostly the Greek or all exclusively the Greek church fathers. And so I think this idea of asceticism was
Yeah.
such a cornerstone to Christianity, including, fasting and keeping boys and girls away from each other when necessary, and, purity, in other words.
Yeah.
And we seem to have lost that today as well. And we seem to have a very bourgeois Christianity in the US and Canada. It kind of drives me crazy, actually. I know I sound like one of my communist professors when I say that, but people, the evangelicals in the US, but I also think the Catholics, they almost virtue signal as much as the left does, in that they're trying to have this kind of lifestyle that's very middle class. And I don't think that's very attractive to people who are really looking for something. For example, in France, I meet a lot of people just at the coffee shop, and they're interested in yoga and Hinduism and Sufism. And they're never interested in Christianity, because I think, if I can read the situation, they think it's too churchy. We have this word churchy or churchianity. I don't know if that translates into Italian, but it's this idea that it's very feminized and very bourgeois. And that's probably one of the reasons I really liked that aesthetic part to it, because I think we need to get back to a more hard-nosed, inward, like being tough on myself, not necessarily tough on others, but tough on myself kind of Christianity. So those schools of philosophy, I think and the connection to Christianity, I think that's something that could be pursued. I would like to learn more about that myself. And maybe in the future, I'll write a book about that.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Pierre Hadot, I believe he originally studied to be a priest.
Interesting. There is a peculiar aspect of ancient way of teaching that has always fascinated me. The fact that in the antiquity, the teacher chose the disciples, right? Today, the opposite happens. The disciple chose the teacher in a
Well, we can
sense.
blame the Italians for that, because wasn't the University of Bologna a student-oriented university?
Yeah. But I think this is really interesting as phenomenon, because this is representative of the inversion of a sort of hierarchy and the source of authority. So I think this fits in a modern revolution, which involves everything, including the way of teaching.
Well, you sound like an English
I
teacher.
apologize if my also to listeners if my English is not perfect, but
I
I
think
hope
you
that the
explained it very
idea
well.
is sorry.
You explained it very well, because I know exactly what you're talking about. It's something that teachers in Taiwan or in France talk about all the time, because it basically comes down to a feeling of not being respected, and parents not even respecting people, the teachers. The teacher is no longer an authority. So it's also part of consumerism, because certainly in Taiwan, people shop around for different schools and different teachers. I don't know if you're totally correct, though, because don't forget there was also the itineracy of students who would always be going around to different teachers. Like Abelard had half a dozen teachers, and of course he was very successful, and he set up his own schools, and then he attracted students. He was a bit of an entrepreneur, and that's when teaching really kind of became a career. I'm doing a bit of reading on that now. He sparred with William of Champeau twice, and but I suppose it's what you're really getting to is the lack of respect of the teacher. But that's across everything. That there's a lack of respect for all authority.
Yeah. So a more general question: what do you see as the state of education today in the world, and in particular in the Western society?
Well, it's very hard to say because we have AI now, and I don't keep up to date as much as I should. And with the internet, with Zoom, you can have classes on Zoom. You know, there's an interesting study that people who are not digital natives actually can process the information on the internet better than people who are digital natives. They are perhaps too passive with the information. What I'm saying is 20-year-olds are very good at using apps, and they're very good at uploading to Instagram, but they don't know how to judge good information from bad information. So the biggest problem nowadays is not really a religious thing. It's more of a technological thing, that because technology seems to be simplifying everything. Just because somebody is studying, for example, Italian on their own doesn't mean they are an autonomous learner. They may be independent, but they haven't taken charge. They're not being critical thinkers. In other words, they're not deciding how to study and what to study. So one of the issues is critical thinking. I think it's becoming worse because people are so passive. They'll just watch a video on the internet and think they're learning. And teachers also do this. They upload videos for their students. So I think my book can help to address this issue because it tries to break down how we can think about texts and how we can approach texts, how we can read books and try to be more critical, including, although I don't talk about this, the issue of logical fallacies, is especially ad hominem attacks and false dichotomies. That seems to be how we talk to each other nowadays. We simply call each other names, like call somebody a racist or whatever, without listening to what they have to say. And I think the trivium is a tool. I'm also inspired by the essay, The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers. If she could see what things are like now, she probably would not even recognize it as education. So we need to get back to these lost tools of learning so that students know how to be logical and how to sense the tone and the connotation of words. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. They don't have those tools of critical thinking.
Yeah. Do you agree that one of the main problems for a correct and free paideia today is the education monopoly in the hands of the state, both from the content that from the methodological point of view? I mean, I don't think this is the main issue of education in USA, maybe, but in Europe, this is certainly a real problem for Catholics. What's your impression?
I totally agree with you. I think it is a big problem, and it's probably a bigger problem in the US than we think it is, although they always try so admirably to take responsibility. I think parents are probably too busy trying to pay the rent to deal so much with their kids' education. But I think that they do have to get more involved now than perhaps 50 years ago. I do think that if you have a state monopoly, then of course, and they're putting all the money into it, then they will form, you know, the French word formation, they will train the thinking, they will program the students in how to think. So they don't teach them how to think, they just give them the content. And like I say, they teach them to think in terms of false dichotomies and ad hominems and to believe what the state wants them to believe. So yes, I do think that the power of education should be in the hands of the parents and the families. And there should be independent schools. Of course there should be. That is a major problem.
Yeah. You mentioned a lot of times logical fallacies. I have often I have often the impression that we are living today a historic moment which is similar in a sense to that time in ancient Greece where sophists, right, ruled the the education, the teaching environment. Do you think we live an analogous moment? And do you think there could be a new Socrates who will fight this issue, this problem?
Well, did Socrates, did he not say, I am the wisest because I know I am not wise?
Yeah.
And I think that's the heart of Western intellectual curiosity, that humility that some of the thinkers had. Nowadays, I think another way of thinking is, I know I am the least brainwashed because I know I'm brainwashed. Most people don't realize that they're brainwashed, and so how can they possibly step out of their brainwashing? There was an interesting article by Caitlin Johnson. I think it was linked at the Lou Rockwell website, and she said very brilliantly, the problem is not only content, we are being brainwashed about the form of our thinking, how we think. And that's what I'm saying with the false dichotomy and the ad hominem. Either you hate Donald Trump or you're a Nazi. Either you get the vaccine or you're going to kill your grandmother. Either you support this or some. It always goes back to being a Nazi or a sexist or a misogynist. So you have to agree with all the feminists or you're a misogynist. So they're labeling of people without, and then the same people, the same teachers who talk like that are trying to teach critical thinking to their students. A label is not a critical thought. So we have to first admit that we're being
It's typical of totalitarianisms, labeling people.
Well, yeah, it is. And we're so weak to fight against that. And as soon as they want another war, they just start rolling out the Hitler rhetoric. And I use the word rhetoric in the modern sense of it being cheap language, not of it being elegance. So we have to somehow, how do we step out of that? So my question is always, why do they want me to hate Donald Trump? Why do they want me to hate something? Or why do they want me to follow this? We have to go to a higher level of thinking. Why are they always fighting a war? And why are they always using this Nazi and Hitler terminology? What does that serve? So there was a tragedy of a 3-year-old boy who was floating in the Rio Grande. He died trying to cross to America. And this picture during the first Trump administration was put on TV for 2 weeks straight with TRUMP on the screen. And what does that do to people's thinking? It makes them enraged. Now, I can't remember if it was that particular incident or another one, but somebody pointed out, oh, that occurred. That picture was taken when Obama was president. But it doesn't stop the rage because the programming has been going on for 2 weeks. And now you're trying to speak logically to people who have arrived at something emotionally. And you can never use logic to talk people out of their emotional thinking. That's what feminists call mansplaining. They say you're just mansplaining. They don't want to hear it. And a lot of conservatives get frustrated because they try to mansplain or they try to use logic with people who are in a different emotional state. You can't use logic against emotion.
Yeah.
We have to get to the assumptions behind the emotion, but most people don't want to look at their assumptions, but it's their assumptions which is a thought. It's very hard to dislodge people from that. So most people just don't talk about things nowadays. People are not talking about certain things. Like in France, they just talk about superficial things.
Yeah. You said I'm using the term rhetoric in a modern sense. That's interesting. Because when you were speaking about that, I reminded about Aristotle rhetoric, right? Can you explain the main differences, in your opinion, between the rhetoric in the modern sense and the rhetoric, the true rhetoric in the classical sense? And did you write something about this issue in your volumes?
Well, I suppose by the modern rhetoric, we just mean when the politicians in the U.S., for example, are throwing mud balls at each other, and then they'll say, "Oh, that's just rhetoric. That's whatever the issue is." It's a way to defend yourself from saying that's not true. They're just exaggerating things. It's dishonest. But of course, the whole book is about rhetoric, and but it's rhetoric in the sense of it does go back to the sophists, and Plato objected to what the sophists were doing because he thought they were all being dishonest, and then he wanted to use a dialectic. But I believe in one of his later works, he realized, or he has one of his characters say that if we just use dialectic, we're going to end up with something like relativism, what we would today call relativism, because you can knock everything down, nothing's sacred. And we all know that Aristotle disagreed with Plato about rhetoric, and he gave it a very nice position. He thought it was an honorable discipline. And if you are an American high school student studying for the SAT or AP English, you will know ethos, logos, pathos. So appeals to authority, appeals to logic, reasoning, and appeals to emotion. So, and I think that Augustine saw the value in that as well. Most of the church fathers realized that if our intellectual opponents have rhetoric and we don't, they're going to crush us with their manipulation. So we need to educate ourselves on rhetoric so we can know what games they're playing. And of course, we're going to use it in a Christian way. So you have John Chrysostom, for example. I think nowadays, because we've given rhetoric a bad name, we've disarmed people, and that's why they're so easily programmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, Marshall McLuhan, I think he was a Canadian, and he wrote in the same vein as Noam Chomsky about this whole manufacturing consent and how language is used to program us. And I found out after I started my book that Marshall McLuhan wrote his PhD thesis at Cambridge on the trivium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was published in 2007 at Ginkgo Press. So I think that in a way we have to fight the false rhetoric, the rhetoric of the sophists of today, with the true rhetoric. We have to know about it because right now we're defenseless. And when you talk about big education, let's call it big education, like there's big ag and big pharma. There's big propaganda, all the national, like CNN and BBC, and we are defenseless against their programming because we don't understand that a lot of it is just programming, and they're using name calling, like calling us Nazi and so on, and we're not thinking.
And we don't have a counter strategy as Catholics, right?
I think you mentioned in America, I think that the classical education system in the US is very well advanced, both by Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
I believe it was started more by the Protestants, but I think the Catholics have more than made up. So I think what's happening in the US is you have, as many people have said, the country is really divided, because the people who have been brought up in a classical education sense, they can see what's going on, but the other people seem to be reacting to the programming. So they become violent and they call names, and they don't want to listen to the mansplaining. But I do think that there is a lot of progress being made. Just if you look at the internet, there's an endless number of high quality classical education materials out there.
Yeah, in USA, of course. In Europe, I'm not sure.
But I think eventually Europe will always follow whatever the US does. We can always hope so. Or at least Europeans can try that on their own, like when they're finished their own schooling, they can go to the US. But I do think if there's a good foundation in the US, I think it can spread. I'm hoping it can spread, although I know exactly what you mean. I think Canada is the same. We have, even in the Catholic schools, which are often funded by the government in Canada, the Catholic schools tend to follow the zeitgeist of today in everything. So just because it has the word Catholic doesn't mean it's Catholic. Doesn't mean it is what it says. So I know exactly what your problem is in Italy, because it's the same thing in Canada. But because there's so many materials out there, I think it's unavoidable that at some point they're going to start to make inroads.
I see. How these notions apply to catechesis teaching?
That's a very good idea, because I think we're also frustrated when somebody challenges a Catholic, and most Catholics don't have anything to respond with, whether it's, oh, you guys worship the Virgin Mary. Oh, the saints are all demons. You pray to saints and they're all demons. Oh, what about the Crusades? There's a huge lack of knowledge. And I think at the moment, I think it's Chad Ripperger, the father, the exorcist, in America. I've listened to a number of his interviews, and he made the point that nowadays Catholics really have to be responsible for themselves because of the situation in the church, and probably responsible for their children as well. But if here in Toulouse, I go to the Christ the King. It's the Latin. It's the Order Institute of Christ the King. They do the Mass in Latin.
Yeah,
I think catechism should be done, especially nowadays, by the priests, and that would be it. That's all I can say about that. I went to a few talks at the cathedral here, and the priests were very, very good. They were very good, but I noticed after one time there was a bit of a kerfuffle about abortion, and some of the women who were Catholics were berating the priest about abortion, and he did a very good job of defending the Catholics of the Catholic Church's teaching, and then he brought it back to the topic at hand. So I think there is an attempt, but my opinion is catechism should be in the hands of priests or teaching orders, and not the laity, especially given the situation that the church is in now.
Yeah. I'd like to ask other two questions. The first one is, can you tell us more about the second volume, which you are editing with Alex right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it goes, so the first volume is up to the year 500. So the second one will go up to about 1050, thereabouts approximately. So the first chapter is called The Christianization and Medievalization of Ancient Paideia. So in other words, there's a further sifting process and developmental process in Christian Paideia that was so apparent with, you see that in the first volume with, oh my goodness, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen and Boethius, who was a wonderful writer, and Jerome, who had lots to say about practical education, and of course, Augustine. So the second volume continues on. So how did Paideia, see, my argument would be that the Greek Paideia was fulfilled through the Christian church. It was meant for the Christian church. And so there's lots of exciting developments in the trivium and the quadrivium. And there's an interesting French author. I'm here in Toulouse, so I use the French libraries. A wonderful author, Jacques Fontaine, who wrote a 2 or 3 volume study on Isidore of Seville. I don't know if it's in English, but it is fantastic. It's one of my favorite books. And because I used to think, oh, Isidore, what a boring guy. He's just doing all this encyclopedism and grammar and all this. And I just saw him in a new way. He's one of my favorites now. I'm talking Isidore. His approach to grammar almost had an ontological or metaphysical feel to it that Jacques Fontaine brings out. And how the etymology, the origin of a word was really something related to its essence, you could say. Although I think that Isidore realized that Latin was not pure and that not every word was originally some sort of original mystical ontological entity. But it's a very nice way of looking at Isidore. So I've got a couple of chapters on him. And of course, everybody loves the Irish in the early medieval period. And so that was a great and fun thing to research. But what was really interesting for me was the interaction between the Irish and the Anglo-Saxons and how they contributed so much to each other. And there was such strong interaction. And you ended up with England having 2 streams of Christianity. Where you have the missionary Augustine sent, not the Augustine of Hippo, Augustine sent by the Pope, centered in Canterbury. That was more of a Romanitas kind of Christianity. And then you had the Celtic Christianity of the Irish in the northern part of England. And this was all worked out. We all know the history to that, about the dating of Easter and all that. This was interesting because Ireland was almost like Egypt, where you had a lot of hermits or maybe 2 or 3 monks living, and they attracted students. And it would have been a spiritual and also aesthetic education. But the other thing that's interesting is that the Irish had already had their own education system. They had their Irish law and they had their poetry, their own literature. And this continued alongside the Christian education, and they mutually supported each other. I can't remember which saint, St. Columbus, actually supported these schools because they saw them as sort of feeder schools for their own. So that took the part of the Greek classics. So those chapters are quite fascinating. I had to say I had a little bit more fun writing this book than the first one. Okay. I also tried to be, I don't want to say the word ecumenical, but how can I say this? I respect the Orthodox and the Greek contribution. So I tried to do some research on the Byzantine education system. They went through their own dark ages, but they also had some very interesting teachers like Michael Psellos, who was a great rhetorician or rhetor. And sometimes he was criticized because some people felt he didn't actually know anything. He just knew how to talk about stuff. So that was some interesting. He was criticized by an important bishop, for example, and there was a letter writing between them. So there was lively debates within the Byzantine Empire that I think is pertinent to us in the West as well.
You said a very interesting idea, the fact that the Greek school was made for Christianity, right? In a sense. And I don't know if you have ever heard about another French philosopher, writer, Gonzague de Reynaud, French-speaking Swiss philosopher, actually. He was a Swiss philosopher, Gonzague de Reynaud. And he had this interesting idea of Europe as a house built on several levels, right? Mm-hmm. And one of these levels is the Greek culture, including the educational system, right? And the what's the English term? I think the roof.
Okay.
Tetto
Yes.
in Italian, the roof.
Yes. The roof. Yes.
Yeah. The roof is Catholicism.
Okay.
So all the levels point to the roof, the Catholic Church. I think this is a very, very interesting idea of Europe. The levels are the Greek culture, the Roman law, and the German spirituality, right? And so what you said before reminded me about this writing, Zagder in old writings.
Okay, interesting. Well, I would use the word fulfillment, and in
Yeah.
volume 2, you can see the fulfillment of Greek paideia in the work of the churchmen, of these churchmen who are working so hard. So I'm not. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it, for sure.
Yeah. And what can you tell us about your current research that,
Yes.
God willing, will be in the third volume of this series at this
It'll
point?
probably go up 1,000 to the year 1300. Sorry, or to the year 1200, and you've got the school of Chartres, which I'm looking at, and their treatment of science, and because this is really seen as the age of dialectic, starting with even before Saint Anselm, but he really did contributed a lot, and then of course the famous Abelard, but it's also an era of a turn towards science, the natural world in the 12th century.
Yeah.
But you also have people like Hugh of St. Victor who are still love the old poetry. So they're not necessarily dialecticians. And then you also have Bologna and everything that went on there with laws. You just mentioned the Roman law. And so that comes into life as well. And you have dialectic. I think it's a very interesting use of dialectic. And they Christianized, the Emperor Justinian was already a Christian, but a lot of those laws that he brought together in the 6th century were pagan or pre-Christian laws. So there was a lot of sifting, and the trivium was used as a tool for that. So I find that I'm spending more and more time writing on the history of Bologna, and also the ars dictaminis, which was the use of rhetoric in letter writing from the papal curia. So you have lots of developments in Italy. We usually think of these centuries centered around Paris with Abelard and William of Champeaux. It's all very interesting. But there were a lot of developments in other parts of Europe. And it was just a continuation of this fulfillment of bringing the ancient achievements into Christendom.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Brian Welter, for this talking. And
Thank you.
to our readers, I encourage you to delve into the first volume of this series about Christian Paideia. Of course, again, you can find it on www.aroucapress.com and the other treasures of Arouca Press. Until next time, may we all continue seeking truth with courage and faith. See you.
Bye.